Keon Ashford adjusted his fancy tie as he walked into the nicest restaurant in the city. The man at the front desk smiled and said, "Your usual table, Mr. Sterling?" "Yes, and make sure there's a bottle of the 82 Bordeaux ready. My date will be here soon," Keon replied, looking at his expensive watch. Genevieve, his girlfriend, was always late. At first, it had annoyed him, but now he thought it was kind of cute. Keon had everything: a great job, respect, and a beautiful girlfriend. At 42, his life was perfect. Genevieve showed up 15 minutes later, turning heads in her red dress. She kissed his cheek, careful not to mess up her lipstick. "Sorry I'm late, darling," she said. "A board meeting ran over. You know how it is." Keon nodded. He understood. Genevieve ran a big company just like he did. That's why they were so good together. Not like Isabella. He stopped that thought. He didn't think about Isabella anymore. That part of his life was over. "You look beautiful," he said, pouring her a glass of wine. Genevieve smiled. "The merger is going through," she said proudly. "Thompson Industries agreed to all our terms. We should celebrate." Keon was about to answer when he noticed something at the other end of the restaurant. A waitress carrying a heavy tray moved carefully between tables. Her black uniform was tight around her very pregnant belly. Something about the way she moved seemed familiar. The waitress turned and Keon's world stopped. It was Isabella. She looked different. Her long, dark hair was tied back, and she had shadows under her eyes. But what really caught his attention was her round belly. She was clearly at least 7 months pregnant. 7 months ago, Keon had still been married to Isabella. 7 months ago, right before everything fell apart. "Keon, are you listening?" Genevieve's voice broke through his thoughts. She followed his gaze and frowned. "Is something wrong?" "No," Keon said quickly. "Nothing's wrong. Tell me more about the merger." But he couldn't concentrate. His eyes kept drifting to Isabella. She hadn't seen him yet, and he held his breath every time she came near their table. How had she ended up here? The last he'd heard, she'd moved across town. He had made sure she got enough money to live comfortably after the divorce. So why was she waiting tables? And the baby, could it be his? He tried to focus on Genevieve, but his mind raced. He wanted to leave, pay the bill, and pretend he hadn't seen Isabella. But then their eyes met. The tray she was carrying wobbled, but she didn't drop it. Her face went pale, then red, but she kept walking, pretending not to see him. Her deep brown eyes, once filled with love, now showed pain and pride. Genevieve's sharp voice broke the moment. "What is wrong with you tonight? You've barely said a word." "I'm sorry," Keon said. "I just remembered something about the Thompson deal. Let's get the check." Genevieve pouted, but agreed. Keon paid the bill, leaving a big tip. He watched as Isabella disappeared into the kitchen. His chest felt tight. If the baby was his, then Isabella had been working a tough job while pregnant, while he sat in fancy restaurants and lived in luxury. Genevieve stood and said, "Let's go, darling. The Andersons are leaving. We can talk to them in the parking lot." Keon followed her out, but he couldn't stop thinking about Isabella. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept seeing her face and her pregnant belly. The TV in his bedroom played quietly, but he wasn't listening. His phone buzzed with a text from Genevieve. "You seem distracted tonight. Everything okay?" He didn't reply. Instead, he went to his office and opened his laptop. He hadn't deleted Isabella's number, just buried it in his contacts. His finger hovered over the call button. What would he even say? "Sorry, I ignored your calls. Is that my baby?" The next morning, Keon went to work early. His assistant, Catherine, looked surprised. "You're early, Mr. Sterling. Want coffee?" "No," Keon said. "I need my phone records and old emails from 7 months ago." Catherine was quick. In an hour, everything was on his desk. Keon saw all the calls and emails from Isabella. She had tried to reach him 12 times in 1 week. Her last email had a subject line that made his hands shake. "Important news about our future." Keon opened it. "Keon, I know you don't want to hear from me, and I understand that you've moved on. But this isn't about us anymore. I'm pregnant. The doctor confirmed it yesterday. It's yours. You know I've never been with anyone else. I'm not asking for anything. I just thought you should know you're going to be a father." Keon slammed his laptop shut. He had ignored this. He had been too busy with work and Genevieve to care about Isabella or the baby. His phone rang. It was Genevieve. "Darling, lunch with the Thompsons is set for today," she said. "Cancel it," Keon replied. "What? This is important." "Cancel everything. I have something to do." He hung up. Keon drove back to the restaurant. The same man from last night was at the front desk. "Mr. Sterling, your usual table?" "No, I need to know when Isabella Winters works." The man hesitated. "Sir, I can't give out that information." Keon placed several $100 bills on the desk. The man sighed and said, "She works lunch shifts Tuesday through Saturday and Sunday dinners." It was Tuesday. Keon waited at the bar, sipping water, watching as the lunch crowd arrived. Then Isabella walked in, tying her apron around her belly. She looked tired but kept working. After 3 hours, her break finally came. She walked past Keon into the break room and he followed. She sat down, rubbing her back. "You have 5 minutes," she said. "I'm sorry," Keon began. "I didn't read your email. I didn't answer your calls. I left you alone. I was wrong." Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but she stayed calm. "Is that all?" "No, I want to help. Money, a better job, anything." Isabella shook her head. "I don't need your money, Keon. I needed you 7 months ago when I found out I was pregnant. I needed you 6 months ago when I couldn't stop throwing up and lost my job. I needed you 5 months ago when I had to move to a smaller apartment because I couldn't afford the old one. Now, I don't need you. I don't need you." Keon felt ashamed. He had been living in luxury while she struggled. He looked at her and said, "I want to make it right." Isabella stood up, using one hand to support her back. "You can't make this right, Keon. You can't just throw money at me after leaving for 7 months and expect everything to be okay," she said. "That's your problem. You think money can fix everything." Keon looked sad. "Then tell me what to do," he pleaded. "Tell me how I can fix this." Isabella stared at him for a long time. Keon saw how tired she looked, how hurt, but also how strong she was. Finally, she said, "I have to get back to work. My break is over." "Isabella, please," Keon begged. "If you really want to make things better," Isabella said, stopping at the door, "prove you can be someone I can count on. Show me you can keep your promises and think about someone other than yourself." She left, leaving Keon standing alone in the break room, surrounded by lockers and the smell of food. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, completely lost. Later, Keon went back to his office. Genevieve, his fiancée, was there waiting for him. She sat in his chair and tapping her perfect nails on the desk. "Why did you cancel lunch with the Thompsons?" she asked angrily. "Do you know how hard it was to set that up?" Keon walked to the window and stared at the tall buildings in the city. He had helped build them, but now they felt like reminders of how selfish he had been. "My ex-wife is pregnant," he said quietly, "with my baby." Genevieve froze, her face full of shock. What do you mean Isabella is pregnant?" "I saw her last night." When Keon explained, "She's 7 months along. She tried to tell me, but I never read her messages." Genevieve got up, her heels clicking loudly. "Keon, she's probably just after your money," she said. "You know how people are." Keon turned to her, seeing her differently now. Her perfect looks, her fancy friends, and her obsession with money suddenly didn't feel right. "No," he said firmly. "Isabella isn't like that. She's working as a waitress. If she wanted my money, she would have taken me to court a long time ago." Genevieve's face turned cold. "So what now? Are you going to play house with some waitress? Think about your reputation, Keon. Think about your deals." "I don't care about those deals," Keon said. "You don't mean that," Genevieve argued. She reached for his arm, but he stepped back. "That waitress," Keon said, his voice rising, "is Isabella, the woman I was married to for 8 years, the woman I left when she needed me most." Genevieve grabbed her bag and stormed out. "Call me when you come to your senses," she said angrily, slamming the door behind her. Kian didn't stop her. Instead, he called his assistant, Catherine. "Cancel all my meetings for the week," he told her, "and get me everything about pregnancy. Books, websites, anything I need to know about what happens at 7 months." Kian had just arrived for his usual lunch when he walked into the room and immediately sensed something was wrong. He hadn't expected to walk in on the scene unfolding before him. His face changed quickly, from concern to furious, when he saw Genevieve standing with a checkbook in her hand. He didn't even need to ask. He could tell something wasn't right. "What the hell is going on here?" Kian demanded, his voice sharp and laced with anger. Genevieve didn't flinch. "I was just making Isabella a very generous offer," she said with a cold smile, her eyes flickering to the checkbook in her hand. Isabella stood firm, her back straight and her hands still resting protectively over her belly. "I don't want your money, Genevieve," she said quietly, but with unwavering strength. "And I don't need your interference." Kian turned to Isabella, his expression softening, but there was a fire in his gaze. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice gentler now, but still tinged with disbelief. Isabella nodded. "She offered me money to disappear, to give up the baby for adoption." Kian's eyes darkened as he turned back to Genevieve. "How dare you even think you can make such an offer? This is none of your business." Genevieve's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, holding the check out towards Isabella. $2 million, she said, as if the amount would somehow change things. "Take it and go. Let the baby have a better life. Let Kian move on." Isabella's hands trembled slightly, but she didn't let her guard down. "No," she said firmly, her voice stronger than it had ever been. "I don't want your money, and I'm not giving up my baby." Genevieve scoffed, clearly not used to being rejected. "You'll regret this," she muttered, but there was no trace of the previous confidence in her voice. "Leave," Isabella said, her tone unwavering. "And don't come back." Kian, now seething with rage, stepped forward. "Get out, Genevieve, now." Without another word, Genevieve stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The moment she was gone, Kian turned to Isabella, his anger still simmering, but replaced by concern for her. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Isabella took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm fine, Kian. Thank you for standing up for me." Kian's heart swelled with emotion. "I'll never let anyone treat you like that again, Isabella. I won't let anyone take away what's important to us." As they stood there, the weight of the moment hung in the air. Neither of them spoke, but in the silence they both understood something had shifted between them. Kian knew he had a long way to go to prove he could be the man they needed, but he was ready for the challenge. For the first time in a long time, he was willing to fight for something that truly mattered. "What are you doing?" Kian demanded, his voice sharp with anger. Genevieve looked at him with calm composure, almost as if nothing had happened. "I'm solving your problem, darling, like I always do," she said, her voice smooth and elegant. Kian wasn't buying it. His anger was evident now. "The only problem here is you," he said coldly, his eyes narrowing. Isabella, who had been standing there, her face pale and looking fragile, tried to stand tall. She spoke quietly, almost as if she was trying to keep everything under control. "I'm fine," she said, her voice weak, "just feeling a little dizzy." Kian's eyes immediately shifted to Isabella, sensing the weakness in her voice. He quickly moved to her side, his hand gently supporting her elbow. "You need to sit down," he insisted, his tone filled with concern. Isabella hesitated for a moment, trying to be strong. "I'm okay," she said, but her voice didn't sound convincing. She swayed slightly, and Kian caught her just in time. "Isabella, you need to sit down," Kian said more firmly this time. He knew something wasn't right. He could see that she wasn't feeling well. "I'm calling an ambulance." "No," Isabella protested weakly. She didn't want to go to the hospital. "I can't afford to miss work." Kian didn't hesitate. His decision was made. "Forget the bills. I just want you and the baby to be okay. Keon made the call for the ambulance, all while never leaving Isabella's side. He watched her closely, his concern growing. Call an ambulance, he ordered one of the staff members. He could hear Genevieve still standing there with her usual elegant posture trying to interrupt, but Keon wasn't having any of it. Get out, Keon said to Genevieve, his voice icy. We're done. Whatever was between us, it's over. Genevieve's perfect composure cracked. She looked stunned, almost desperate. You're throwing everything away for her? She asked, her voice trembling with emotion. For a baby that might not even be yours? Keon didn't even look back at her. Security, he called out, and within seconds, 2 large men appeared. Escort Miss Reynolds out. Make sure she knows she's no longer welcome here. As the security guards led Genevieve away, Keon turned his attention back to Isabella, who looked even weaker now. Her knees buckled, and Keon was quick to catch her again, easing her into a nearby chair. Isabella winced in pain, her hand pressed against her stomach. I've been having pains all morning, she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought they'd pass. Keon's heart dropped as he felt a wave of fear. He didn't like the sound of that at all. He stepped closer to her. Why didn't you say something sooner? He asked urgently. Why didn't you go home? Isabella's face was pale, and she seemed exhausted. I can't afford to miss work, she replied weakly. The medical bills are already... Forget the bills, Keon said fiercely. Nothing matters except you and the baby being okay. The ambulance arrived quickly, and the paramedics were soon helping Isabella onto the stretcher. She reached out and grabbed Keon's hand, her grip tight. Don't leave me, she whispered, her voice filled with fear. I won't, Keon promised, his voice thick with emotion. Never again. The ride to the hospital was tense and quiet. Isabella's blood pressure was high, and the doctors were concerned. They kept checking on her, monitoring her every move. Keon held her hand the entire time, his mind racing with worry. He remembered all the things he'd read about pregnancy complications, and he couldn't stop thinking about how scared he was. Once they arrived at the emergency room, Dr. Olivia Hart quickly took charge. Mrs. Anderson, she said, addressing Isabella, you're experiencing preeclampsia. We need to get your blood pressure down immediately. Isabella's eyes widened in fear. It's too early, she said, her voice shaking. The baby could be in danger. Dr. Hart reassured her. We'll do everything we can to keep you and your baby safe, she said, her tone calm and confident. She turned to Keon. Are you the father? Keon didn't hesitate for a second. Yes, he said firmly, before Isabella could even speak. He could see the concern in her eyes, and he knew that she needed him now more than ever. Dr. Hart began listing off things she needed from Keon, like medical history and insurance information. Keon nodded, not even thinking twice about what needed to be done. I'll take care of it, he said. Whatever you need, whatever it costs, I'm handling it. Hours passed in a blur of tests, medications, and worried consultations. Isabella was moved to a private room in the maternity ward, where the monitors beeped steadily, tracking both her and the baby's vital signs. Keon stayed by her side, never leaving, doing everything he could to make sure everything would be okay. He called Catherine and had her cancel everything on his calendar. He called his lawyer and told him to start drafting papers to provide for the baby. He even called Lucas at the law firm and made arrangements for Isabella to keep her job if she needed it. Around midnight, Isabella's blood pressure finally stabilized and the contractions stopped. Dr. Hart gave the order for complete bed rest for the rest of the pregnancy. You'll need constant care, she explained. Any stress or physical exertion could trigger early labor again. Isabella looked defeated. I live alone, and I can't afford a nurse, she said, her voice tired and sad. You're coming home with me, Keon said firmly. He could see how much Isabella didn't want to ask for help, but he wouldn't let her refuse. I've already set up the nursery. I have staff who can help, and I can work from home. You won't be alone. Isabella hesitated. I'm not sure, she said, but Keon could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He gently took her hand again, his voice soft but determined. Please, Isabella, let me do this. Not for me, not even for you, but for our baby. Isabella looked at their joined hands, her eyes filled with emotion. After a long moment of silence, she nodded. Okay, she said quietly, but with a condition. Just until the baby comes. And I want a written agreement that this doesn't affect any future custody arrangements. Keon felt his heart crack at her caution. He knew he had earned her distrust, but he was willing to do whatever it took. I'll have my lawyer draw up whatever paperwork you want, he said, his voice sincere. Right now, I just want you both to be safe. Dr. Hart smiled gently. I'll start the discharge paperwork for tomorrow morning, Mrs. Leisbach. Anderson, remember, complete bed rest, no exceptions. After the doctor left, an uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Isabella was quiet, lying in the hospital bed, looking fragile and vulnerable. Keon's heart ached as he looked at her. Finally, he broke the silence. I'm sorry about Genevieve, he said softly. I had no idea she would. You really didn't send her? Isabella's voice was tired but curious. God, no, Keon said, shaking his head. I ended things with her weeks ago, right after I found out about the baby. He paused for a moment, then added, she offered me $2 million to disappear, to give up the baby for adoption. Isabella's face softened, and she reached for his hand. I know, she said quietly. I could see how angry you were when you heard her. The old Keon, the Keon from the end of our marriage, he would have tried to smooth things over to keep everyone happy. You didn't. I'm not that man anymore, Keon said quietly. Or at least, I'm trying not to be. Just then, the baby kicked hard enough that Keon could feel it through Isabella's stomach. Isabella smiled, her face softening. Someone's got an opinion about that, she said softly, her voice filled with tenderness. Keon smiled back, his throat tight with emotion. This was the first time he had felt his child move, and it filled him with a sense of awe. It's amazing, he whispered. Get some rest, he said reluctantly, though he didn't want to leave her side. He slowly let go of her hand, but his eyes stayed locked on hers. I'll be right here in this chair if you need anything. Isabella's eyes were already closing, the medications and the stress taking their toll. As she drifted off to sleep, Keon sat there in the chair, listening to the steady beep of the monitors. He looked out the window at the city lights, which twinkled like stars. But for the first time in years, Keon wasn't thinking about business deals or money. One tick of the grandfather clock at a time. Some things were more important than all the business deals in the world. 3 weeks had passed since Isabella moved in, and the tension in the house had slowly begun to ease. The grandfather clock's steady ticking became a comforting background noise as they lived together peacefully. But life never stays peaceful forever, as they were about to find out. Keon heard a voice from the front door. Your mother is here, Mrs. Liu Zhang called. Isabella, who had been reading by the window, turned pale. Amelia Grant, Keon's mother, had never liked that her son had married Isabella, a girl from a middle-class family. The last time they talked, Amelia had said Isabella's failure to have a child was enough reason for a divorce. Keon quickly ran down the stairs, but it was too late. Amelia had already entered the living room, walking in like a queen. Keon, she said, ignoring Isabella completely. I had to hear about all this from Genevieve, about your ex-wife's condition. Keon spoke sharply. Now is not a good time. Amelia looked at Isabella, eyeing her stomach with a look of disgust. I suppose you think this baby will fix everything? That a baby will make everything better? She asked. I didn't ask Keon for anything, Isabella said quietly, placing one hand on her stomach. I'm here because of medical problems. Of course, Amelia said with a smile that was as sharp as a knife. You just made sure he found out about it in the most dramatic way possible, didn't you? Keon stood between Isabella and his mother. You don't know what's going on here, he said firmly. I know you're ruining everything, Amelia said. The Thompson deal is done and your company stock is dropping all because you couldn't handle this quietly. Isabella tried to stand up, but Keon helped her sit back down. Don't, he said. The doctor said I should rest. Amelia stared at them coldly. You're carrying my grandchild, so this is very much a family matter. What are we going to do about it? Keon helped Isabella sit back down. We're not going to do anything about it. Isabella and I are handling it our way. Amelia laughed. Your way is destroying everything. Your father and I built the Sterling name, and now look at what you're doing, playing house with your pregnant ex-wife. The grandfather clock chimed loudly, its sound filling the tense room. Isabella's hand tightened on her stomach. Keon, something's wrong, she whispered. Keon's heart stopped. What's happening? He asked. Isabella nodded, her face twisting with pain. It's the pain again, she said. Call Dr. Hart now, Keon told Mrs. Liu Zhang, who quickly ran to help. Amelia watched in alarm as Keon rushed around. Be reasonable, she said. There are private clinics for this kind of thing. This doesn't need to be so messy. Keon's voice was cold. Get out! Don't come back until you can accept that Isabella and this baby are my family now. Amelia argued. I am your family. No, Keon said. You've only cared about the family name and money. I'm done with all of that. Dr. Hart arrived quickly, examined Isabella, and her face became serious. We need to get her to the hospital immediately. The stress has made her blood pressure dangerously high. Keon gently lifted Isabella, ignoring his mother's complaints. I'll drive her myself. Mrs. Liu Zhang, please show my mother out. On the way to the hospital, Isabella squeezed Keon's hand. I'm sorry. I should have stayed calm. Keon shook his head. Don't apologize. This is not your fault. At the hospital, Isabella was rushed into the maternity ward. Dr. Hart gave her medication to try to stop the contractions and lower her blood pressure. The baby's heartbeat is too fast, she said. We need to get this under control. Keon paced nervously. What can I do? Just stay with me, Isabella said softly. Please. The medication started to work slowly, but Dr. Hart said Isabella should stay in the hospital overnight for observation. Keon refused to leave her side, setting up camp in a hard hospital chair. Around midnight, Isabella spoke softly in the dark. Your mother was right about one thing. Keon started to say something, but Isabella continued. A baby won't magically fix what was broken between us. Keon paused. I know, but maybe it can give us a reason to build something new, something better. I'm scared, Isabella admitted. Not just about the baby, but about everything. What if we can't do this? What if we hurt each other again? Keon moved his chair closer to her. Do you remember what you said to me on our wedding day, when I was worried about the rain ruining the ceremony? Isabella smiled a little. You said we can't control the weather, but we can control how we face it together. You were right then, Keon said, and you're right now. We can't control everything, and we can't change the past, but we can choose how we face the future. Isabella's hand found his in the dark. The clock, she said suddenly. Is someone winding it? Mrs. Liu Zhang is taking care of it, Keon said. It's strange, Isabella said softly. When we were married, I found comfort in its ticking. But after you left, I thought I'd never want to hear that sound again. But now it feels like it's counting down to something, not just the baby, but everything. Like each chime is bringing us closer to whatever we're supposed to become. Keon squeezed her hand gently. Whatever that is, we'll face it together if you'll let me. Isabella was quiet for a long time, and Keon thought she had fallen asleep. Then she whispered, Your mother won't be the last one to disapprove. Genevieve won't give up easily. The business world you built won't understand. Let them talk, Keon said firmly. I spent years caring about what others thought. Look where it got me. Alone in a big house, surrounded by people who only cared about my money and status. I lost the one person who loved me for who I was, not for what I had. Isabella smiled softly. Who are you now? Kian thought carefully before answering. I'm all of them, I guess, the good and the bad. But I'm trying to be better, to be worthy of you and our daughter. The hospital machines beeped steadily in the background. It wasn't the comforting sound of the grandfather clock, but as Isabella held his hand, Kian felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not hope that everything would be fixed or that the past could be erased, but hope that sometimes life gives you a second chance to get things right. And this time, he wouldn't let it slip away. After 3 days in the hospital, Isabella was finally well enough to go home. When they returned, the house felt different. It was like the crisis had changed something inside it. The grandfather clock's steady ticking greeted them, and it felt more comforting than ever. I've been thinking, Isabella said one morning a week after they returned, I want to invite my sister Sophia to visit. Of course, Kian said, looking up from his laptop. This is your home, too. Isabella gave him a small look. Sophia wasn't exactly kind to you after the divorce. I deserved it, Kian said simply. The next day, Sophia arrived, full of energy and protective anger. She looked like Isabella, but her face was sharper, harder. So this is where you're keeping her, Sophia said, eyeing the house. Nice cage. Sophia, Isabella warned, don't start. Why not? Sophia snapped. He abandoned you. He left you when you needed him the most. Now suddenly he's playing the good dad? Kian stayed quiet, letting Sophia express her anger. He deserved it. It's not that simple, Isabella said softly. Things have changed. Have they? Sophia asked. Or is he just trying to protect his image? Isabella spoke firmly. Kian has proven himself these past few weeks. He's been here every day, putting me and the baby first. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. I was there when you cried. I helped you move into that tiny apartment because you didn't want his money. The grandfather clock chimed loudly, making everything quiet for a moment. Then Kian spoke softly. You were there when I wasn't. I can never make up for that, but I'm here now and I'm not going anywhere. Sophia looked at Isabella. Do you believe him? Isabella's hand went to her stomach. I believe he's trying. That's all any of us can do. The baby kicked hard, making Isabella wince. Sophia's voice softened. It's a girl? Isabella nodded, smiling. Yes, we're naming her Ava after our grandmother. Kian smiled. It's perfect. Sophia decided to stay for a week to help with Isabella and the baby. After she left, Kian was sitting in his office when the power went out. The backup generator didn't work, and the emergency lights didn't turn on. Isabella sat by the window, lit only by lightning. The clock stopped, Isabella said, her voice full of worry. The silence where the ticking should have been felt wrong, scary. Contractions, Isabella gasped, her face full of pain. Kian's blood ran cold. It's too early, he said. She's not due for another 6 weeks. Sophia grabbed her phone. I'll call Dr. Hart. No signal, Sophia said, looking worried. The landline? Kian asked. The phones are dead too, Sophia said. We need to get her to the hospital. But the storm was flooding the streets. Mrs. Lu Zhang called from the window. The storm drain on Miller Street has overflowed. Isabella squeezed Kian's hand as another contraction hit. The pain was getting worse. I'm calling Ryan, your helicopter pilot, Kian said quickly. Sophia asked in surprise, in this storm? He's the best pilot, and he owes me his life after I helped him last year, Kian replied, already dialing his satellite phone. Ryan answered right away. I know it's bad out there, Kian said, but Isabella needs help. There was a pause. Then Ryan said, give me 20 minutes to get to the helipad. If there's any way to fly in this, I'll find it. The 20 minutes felt like forever. Isabella's contractions were now just 5 minutes apart. She was pale and in pain. Talk to me, she whispered. Distract me. Remember our first date? Kian asked. I tried to impress you with that fancy French restaurant. Isabella smiled a little. And I told you I'd rather have pizza. Kian brushed her hair from her face. That's when I knew you were different from anyone I'd ever met. Isabella gave a small sigh. Different wasn't always good, she said softly. At least, not according to your mom. Keon shook his head. My mom was wrong about everything that mattered. Suddenly, another contraction hit, even stronger. Isabella screamed in pain and squeezed Keon's hand. Where's that helicopter? Sophia asked, pacing by the window. They could hear the helicopter's blades in the distance. I can't land at the house. The trees are too wild in this wind, Ryan said over the satellite phone. Can you get to the country club? Keon asked. It's only 10 minutes away. They could make it. Getting Isabella to the car was hard because the wind was so strong it almost knocked Sophia over. The rain was so heavy it soaked them all. Keon drove carefully through the flooded streets using the SUV to get through deep puddles. Isabella was in the back seat with Sophia, counting the contractions, now just 4 minutes apart. Almost there, Keon said as they turned onto the long driveway of the country club. Then, Isabella screamed. Her water broke. Hurry, Sophia shouted. They could see the helicopter lights in the distance. Ryan had landed on the 9th hole of the golf course. Keon carried Isabella to the helicopter, fighting the wind. Sophia ran ahead to help Ryan. Just as they reached the helicopter, Isabella stopped. Keon, wait, she said. We can't wait. Isabella, we need to get you to the hospital, Keon said. Isabella's voice was urgent. If something happens, I need you to know if I forgive you for everything. Keon's heart squeezed. Nothing's going to happen, he said. I love you. I never stopped, even when I wanted to. Another contraction hit. Something's wrong, Isabella gasped. Ryan came over with a stretcher. They loaded Isabella into the helicopter, Sophia beside her. The flight to the hospital was a blur. Ryan flew fast and kept the helicopter steady through the storm. They landed at the hospital and Dr. Hart rushed out. The baby's in distress, he said. We need to do an emergency C-section. Isabella, Keon called. I'm here, he said, holding her hand. Isabella's voice was weak. Promise me the clock will keep ticking. Keon's heart broke, but he promised. It will, Isabella. Both of you will hear it tick again. 3 hours later, Keon was pacing the waiting room. Sophia was asleep in a chair. Keon couldn't rest. The door opened, and instead of Dr. Hart, his mother, Amelia, walked in. I heard about the emergency airlift, she said. Why didn't you call me? I was a little busy trying to save my family, Keon replied. Amelia sat down beside him, taking his hand. I've been thinking about what you said before, she began. I was so focused on the name Sterling that I forgot what really matters. I was wrong about Isabella. Just then, Dr. Hart came in. Would you like to meet your daughter? He asked. They're both okay. Your daughter's small, just over 4 pounds, but she's strong. Isabella's in recovery now. Keon's heart soared. He followed Dr. Hart to the NICU, where they had to wear gowns and masks. Inside the incubator, Ava was so tiny, with tubes and wires around her, but Keon could see her face. She had Isabella's nose and his chin. Hello, Ava, he whispered, pressing his hand against the glass. She's beautiful, Amelia said softly, tears in her eyes. She looks like you did when you were born. Sophia added, she's a fighter like her mom. A nurse came over and asked if they wanted to touch Ava. Keon carefully put his hand through the incubator and felt Ava's tiny hand grip his finger. That's it, little one, the nurse said. Show your daddy how strong you are. A while later, Isabella woke up in recovery. I'm here, Keon said, kissing her hand. Ava's strong, he assured her. She's beautiful. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. I was so scared. Keon held her hand. You did it. You both did it. Isabella smiled faintly. I meant what I said before, about forgiving you, about loving you. Keon smiled back. I love you too. I never stopped. The next day, Isabella asked if she could see Ava. Dr. Hart said, as soon as you're strong enough to sit up. Isabella nodded, ready to hold her daughter. A month later, Ava was growing stronger every day. She was gaining weight and getting better. The NICU nurse said she might be ready to go home next week. Isabella had spent every moment with her, and Keon only left when he had to. One day, Keon checked the family chat, feeling his heart fill with love. He had a picture of their family moments up, not the fancy ones from his past, but real ones with joy. Isabella had a special gift for Ava. I thought we could put it next to the clock, she said, holding up a silver frame. Inside was a photo of their family in the NICU, all smiling together. It's perfect, Kian said softly. Finally, Ava was ready to leave the hospital. Isabella held her in a tiny yellow onesie, a gift from Amelia. Kian had checked the car seat again and again. When they got home, they were surprised to see yellow butterflies decorating the house, just like in Ava's nursery. Inside, the family was waiting for them, ready to celebrate. As Isabella held Ava, she whispered, "Listen, sweet girl, this clock is so important to us. It's watched us fall in love, fall apart, and find our way back together. Now it will watch you grow." Kian wrapped his arms around them both. "Welcome home," he said softly. Later, as they sat together, Kian knew this was everything he had been searching for: the love of his family, the sound of the clock ticking, and the joy of holding his daughter. His heart was full. The grandfather clock ticked on, not just marking the hours, but the moments of love, hope, and new beginnings. Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Check out our other videos too. See you in the next one.